Hey, friends, welcome back to Purposely Entrusted Motherhood. I'm excited to do an episode on how to go about choosing your right support team for your ideal birth. So, if you see me looking up, I've taken some notes just to kind of help me stay on point with this discussion as we get into it. So, I'm just going to go straight in. So, a little bit about me for those who are new. My name is Amy. I'm a childbirth educator and birth doula, and I have been a birth nerd over 12 years, actively in the birth community for probably the last 5, almost 6 years, and just really have a passion for sharing and educating, um, especially moms, Christian moms, on preparing for birth and walking through their pregnancy as they prepare for the big day of their baby's birth. And so, one of the things that one of the conversations that I often have with the couples that I work with is the topic of who to have at the birth. Obviously, there's the assumption, and in majority, all but two births I've ever attended has the spouse or husband not been there. But I'm assuming that that's your number one person who's going to be at this birth. Second, your birth attendant, whether that be an OBGYN, a nurse midwife, or a licensed midwife, depending on the location of where you are choosing to give birth to your baby. But in addition to those two roles, your partner and your provider, there are other people who you might want to consider having. Some are trained professionals, and others might be people who you have had long relationships with and deep connections with, who you are considering whether or not you want them to be present. So, as you consider who you're going to have at the birth, and we're specifically talking about like actually physically in the room as you labor and push your baby out. Something you really want to consider is your birth plan. So, in my classes, I talk about the dynamic trio, how you want to have the ideal birth plan, you want to have education and preparation, and then you want to have a supportive birth team. And so, having your ideal birth plan kind of informs what kind of education and preparation you'll need to do to achieve that just birth plan. And it also is going to inform who you want to have at your birth and on your birth team. So, in that, for example, if you're having a hospital birth, you would have an OBGYN or a certified nurse midwife as your medical provider. And then you may want to have a birth doula. You will very likely have several nurses during your labor and delivery. And your baby will also have a nurse as well once they are born. And then, whether or not you choose to have a doula, you may opt to have a friend come in that and serve in that type of role, or you may have your own mother. If you are the expectant mom, you may have your mom there, you may have your mother-in-law there, you may have a best friend there. There's different options. It's really a matter of who you're comfortable with, and that's kind of what we're going to get into, of like, how do you decide? Because I'm pretty sure, if you haven't already, you've probably received some messages or some hints at people who are interested in attending your birth, or perhaps that you've considered inviting to your birth, but you haven't quite decided to jump the gun and invite them yet because you're not sure, one, if they want to, and two, if you actually do want them there, like if in the end you end up changing your mind. So, which is always an option. But the very first thing, like I said, you want to consider your birth plan. What is the kind of birth that you are going for? Someone who is looking to birth at the hospital may absolutely want to be induced, may absolutely want to have an epidural, may be someone who has already scheduled their C-section because they previously had a C-section, and they are most comfortable with a second C-section. There are more options and different birth plan scenarios that you're going to see within a hospital birth setting, and more room for changes as well. Sometimes that may be necessary as well in a hospital birth setting. If you are in a home birth or birth center setting, you're going to have either a nurse midwife or a licensed midwife. in that, typically speaking, in those settings. And usually a birth assistant will arrive at the birth at some point in your labor to assist the midwife. And then again, whoever is home. It might be your children are sleeping in the other room, and it might just be your spouse or partner. It might be that you have invited people over. Again, that's more of what we're going to be getting into. But knowing and having a solid relationship with your medical provider after you've decided on your ideal birth plan is like essential and foundational to achieving that birth plan and to establishing the foundational relationship to having that solid support team. Because this is someone, while you at the end of the day are the one who makes the calls as the expectant mother, and you have every right to decline or accept any interventions or and make every decision in that room, at the end of the day you are hiring this professional to help make those decisions based on their education, and ideally they're keeping you informed and allowing you to consent to every one of those recommendations or surrendering to the choices that you want to follow throughout your birth. But you want to have a solid relationship with them. And by relationship, I mean you want to be comfortable enough to have difficult conversations, to ask them hard questions about things like, what is your C-section rate? What, if this happens, or if my baby doesn't switch from a breech position to a more optimal birthing position, will I be only limited to a C-section in that situation? Or are you open to a vaginal birth even in that case? Things like that. These are things, again, you want to feel safe and comfortable asking them about. You may still be nervous. That's understandable because no one likes, I don't think most people enjoy having a conversation that you might disagree with someone on, but you have to feel safe enough to present that question. And if there's any moment where you feel kind of insecure about that, those are things to be paying attention to, especially early on in the pregnancy, because as you get further and further in, your options to change your providers can get a little more tricky further into your pregnancy. So it's good to start having those early on in the pregnancy. I find so many couples who don't think about the birth until they are well into the third trimester, and they find that they hit quite a bit of roadblocks because of things that they didn't realize they wanted, and they've already made some decisions that have limited them in some of those choices. Again, not completely eliminated those choices, but made it a little more challenging. Your partner or spouse is absolutely someone who should also be in a good relationship with you. You should feel safe with them. You should feel comfortable with them. It's not that you didn't argue in the car on the way to your birth location, whatever the case may be. Things aren't always perfect and happy and go lucky, but you want it to be that you both are on the same game plan, that you have had several conversations about how you want the birth to go, where you want to birth, how you feel about your provider, who you want to attend the birth, how you want to be involved in the birth, how you need your partner to be supporting you physically, mentally, emotionally, or don't want them to support you. Whatever the case might be, that line of communication needs to be flowing very well between the two of you. As it likely already has. But if you haven't, this is a good time to start doing some communication exercises and just asking each other questions. What are your fears surrounding the birth? What are you excited about? What are you most nervous about? Things like that. Then the question becomes, do you want a doula? So I, as a doula, and other doulas provide emotional, educational, and physical support to a couple. Most of our physical support, if not all, is to the laboring mother. But sometimes the emotional and often the emotional and educational support, at least when I serve couples, is to both mom and dad, and even at times to grandparents who have been invited to attend the birth as well. And one of the things with deciding on whether to have a doula or not is really considering um, the dynamics of your relationship with your medical provider. Have you felt comfortable with them? Are there things that you just aren't sure of and that you would like an unbiased bias? So having a doula there is not only beneficial to having one person dedicated to only you during your birth, as opposed to the nurses who will be in and out on their shifts and who are helping other laboring moms in the hospital, or a birth assistant who is helping to keep for their midwife and of what is kind of like their specialty, relationship with extended family members, and how all of that impacts what's happening mentally and emotionally, sometimes for the mom and dad in the birth room, um, getting kids where they need to, family members and quite cooperating or that kind of stuff. Knowing all that information for me as a doula, having established that relationship, helps me to kind of get ahead of where mom and dad's mind might be, where that relationship with that family member last left off. Um, but physical support as well. If you are trying to avoid an epidural or aiming for an unmedicated birth and have purposely chosen not to birth at the hospital so that you can have a higher possibility of achieving that unmedicated birth, having a doula there with their training, comfort techniques, and all of that can absolutely be such a comfort and such a support in helping you achieve that ideal birth. Now, the bulk of this conversation comes down to family members and friends. For some families, and even within some cultures, it's kind of there's sometimes is an assumption that the grandmothers at least will be there in the room and present. And now, as couples are currently in, there isn't that necessarily assumption anymore. And so, while there isn't that assumption on the end of the couples, but grandparents might be assuming that they are going to be invited because obviously they're the grandmother and this is their first grandbaby or whatever the case. Um, and so, really navigating that conversation can be awkward if you're a couple who does not like confrontation, or perhaps you and your spouse disagree on who you want to have or not have in the room. So, that can be a really delicate and tricky conversation to navigate, and one that, as I specifically work with Christian couples, one that is definitely worth praying about and asking for discernment on that. Because one of the kind of rules or sayings that are that's tossed around in the birth world is that for the amount of people you have in the room, expect to add like that many hours to your labor. And so the fewer people you have, hopefully the shorter your labor will be. That doesn't mean that you won't have a long labor, but imagine had you had even more people in the room, how much longer it could have gone. Why? Because a mom is not always able to focus when there's so much distraction in the room. Of people trying, some moms feel like they have to entertain. Some moms feel like they have to pretend like they're fine. They don't know how to let their guard down to simply be in the moment. They don't want their mom to see them in pain or their mother-in-law to see them in pain. There's a lot of different dynamics. Also, giving birth is a very vulnerable time for a mother, especially who's laboring, because you may not want to be close during your birth. And so having other people there, you may feel limited and feel like you have to be more discreet. And because you're trying to be polite and keep other people happy and you're perhaps like people pleasing mode, that might delay some of the progress in your birth because you're not able to freely focus and just be in the zone of you and your baby getting yourselves through this process. So really considering things like that. Who would I feel comfortable seeing me however I decide to birth this baby? Who is going to be fully on board with our birth plan and our values, our belief system, and our convictions, and how we've chosen to birth this baby. Um, is this in someone who I'm comfortable with, someone who, if my spouse has to leave the room, I'm going to feel safe with being alone with, someone who is going to help advocate for me if my spouse has left the room, and I'm in the middle of contractions, and perhaps the medical staff is trying to, you know, uh, recommend something that I've already made clear on my birth plan I do not want, um, things like that. So if this is someone who does not like confrontation, if they're high anxiety and they're going to be more stressed and you're going to have to be managing them and helping keep them calm during your labor, you more than likely do not want them at your birth. Um, while your heart may want them at your birth, logically speaking, it's probably not going to be a good idea to have them in the birth room, maybe somewhere else in the house if you're at home, or in the waiting room at the hospital. Those are some options. But those are things that you really want to keep in mind because they will affect how your birth is going. And as a doula, that is something that we are kind of trained to be keeping an eye out for, of what are the dynamics at play here in this birth room. Are there too many lights on? Is there too much noise? Is there someone who's like bringing on a lot of stress and asking a lot of questions while the mom is laboring when they need to just be quiet and observant? Are they too hands-on when the mom wants to be alone and she's communicated that several times? Or are they just standing in a corner when a mom is really wanting to be held and no one is holding her? That kind of stuff. Those are dynamics that um, not only as a doula would we be paying attention to and picking up on, but we would also be stepping in to kind of mediate those situations or serve in that role where the mother has need. Um, Again, considering their values, their beliefs around birth, you may find especially when it comes to birth center or any kind of birth side of the home, that there can be a lot of opinions about that. Not everyone is on board with that. Not everyone is comfortable with an unmedicated birth, even in the hospital. People have very strong opinions. And mean very well, but it might be very unhelpful to what you're wanting to achieve in your birth experience, and your birth is. And not only that, but if they're a mom themselves and they've gone through birth experiences, good or bad, they are bringing those experiences into the birth room as well. And there can be things, especially if they've had a traumatic birth, which can trigger their trauma and bring in their own fears into the birth and create this tension in the room on top of what may already be there, if there are some things happening that may be bringing about concern or whatever the case. So really thinking about, what are their views on birth? What do they believe about unmedicated birth or about epidurals or C-section? Do they have strong opinions either way, or does it line up with what we believe and what we want? Are they someone who is going to be 100% on board with our wishes? If those are a yes, then absolutely consider having them attend your birth. Again, if you and your spouse are in agreement and both feel comfortable with that, never to replace the role of your partner or even the role of a doula if you choose to have a doula, but as just an additional support that's going to help you feel safe and comforted during your labor. These tips are all part of helping you to achieve that ideal birth and having that ideal birth team for you to achieve your ideal birth. You can have a plan, you can educate and prepare yourself, but if you do not have the right team that is on board and wants to, follow suit in your wishes, that can really, when you don't have a team that is on board with you, that can really, you know, really mess with the outcome of your birth. It doesn't mean it's going to make for a bad outcome every time, but it, it messes with it. It lowers your chances of that ideal birth that you wanted. And it's something that you will, as much as you don't want to, end up having to process and really reflect through postpartum. And so you want to be thinking about, after this baby is here, when it's that golden hour that I'm holding my baby, who do I want present? Is it just me and my spouse? Typically, that's what I suggest, just for mom and dad to have that first hour with baby. Even if you had other people in the room. As a doula, I step away or I stay in a corner. Um, Typically, I step away and I'll go get a snack or something for that hour, and then come back and see how parents are doing. You do not need to immediately get your baby weighed. You do not need to get them dressed or get them a bath. Like, that is the time for you and your husband to have that skin to skin contact with baby and everything like that. And so you want someone on your team who's going to know, okay, that baby's out. Well, it's beautiful. Congratulations, kiss. I'm out the door and I'm perfectly fine. And I'm getting you a meal. That's what your support team should be doing. Not, oh, let me hold it. Oh, let me see. Oh, let's get more information. No, they're so precious, and taking up that time that is meant for your bonding. Okay. Assessing individual comfort levels. Again, not only, for you may perhaps have a really close relationship with your father. Perhaps your mother is no longer living or is not a part of life at this time, and you feel very comfortable having your father present. Having a conversation with your spouse and making sure that they're comfortable, or even with your father if you're considering having them there, as to whether they feel comfortable seeing you in labor and giving birth. They might not. And you have to also have room and the willingness to be okay with others not feeling comfortable, not feeling that they're going to be that safe place for you, like they will be postpartum after that. But sometimes something to consider is that it can be very difficult for parents to watch, not only for a spouse, that's one thing, but for parents to watch their child labor to give birth to their baby, knowing that they could have medicine to help, knowing that it doesn't have to be this way. And maybe they've seen other experiences where the mom didn't have to struggle perhaps as much. It can be very difficult to just sit there and feel like your hands are tied with nothing that you can do. And so while it's rewarding for those who can press through that and see what an accomplishment, regardless of how you birth your baby, just the accomplishment of the miracle of that you carried that life and now that life is outside of you and you get to delight as a family in that child. That is such a rewarding moment for grandparents. But how you go about experiencing that rewarding moment, every grandparent is going to be different in that. And so it's good to be aware of the boundaries that are needed for them and for you and your partner, your spouse. And, again, respecting boundaries. If you find that as you've listened through this video, the majority of your responses were no, actually, I wouldn't feel safe with that person. I've never felt safe with that person. That person has very different views on birth and they even agree with any of the decisions that I've made, or I haven't even felt comfortable to tell them our birth plan or whatever. If that's the kind of dynamic and your reaction is kind of, I really don't want them at the birth at all. Like, I don't want them to come to the hospital. I want them, I want to wait a week until they see the baby, and not out of ill intent, but just protection for yourself and for your own boundaries and wanting to just fully be present and in the moment with your husband and your baby, and perhaps other children as well. Like, that's okay too. Those are difficult conversations to navigate, I'm sure, but those are understandable, and those are wishes that are worthy of being respected. And although it might be painful for a grandparent to hear that, and they still may not agree, even if you have the most logical and reasonable and loving explanation and how you go about it, still, it's for them to take a step back and allow you and your husband to be the parents and establishing your family and everything like that. So that is something that, as a doula, when I have couples who have that kind of dynamic playing in um, in their relationships with family members, be it grandparents or aunts and uncles or siblings or whatever, we it's not always easy, but we'll sometimes be the bad guy in the sense of helping you to communicate a message to them from a place of authority, because that's how people will look to us as, and being that mediator to say, like, listen, because of what she's wanting, this is truly best for her and baby, and you don't have to be the one to say it necessarily. So if you aren't working with me as your doula, and would like kind of some feedback on that, feel free to reach out. Or if you do have a doula, talk to them about that and see how they can support you through that. So one last thing as I wrap up is to really consider, as you think about who you want at your birth, really consider how is this person going to respond if there's an emergency situation. If it looked like plan A was going to work out perfectly, and now we've had some drastic changes that are putting mom and baby at risk, and we need a transfer, or we need to leave this room immediately and go to the operating room, or whatever the case. What is their response to that going to be? Are they going to be slow to act in the sense of like, okay, I'm going to listen to whatever the medical team says and just support and be here and help grab things? Or are they someone who's going to panic and make it 10 times worse than what it needs to be? You need a support team that is ready to go, ready to, to move with all the punches that will be thrown at you during labor, and who's, going to be able to manage whatever happens at your birth. Ideally, peaceful, beautiful outcome in the situation. So, just to summarize, again, first of all, before you even think about who you're going to have at your birth, you want to know your ideal birth plan and be in sync with your spouse about what your wishes are, how you're moving forward. Make sure that your medical provider is someone that you have a solid relationship with, that you feel comfortable asking questions about or holding your ground with, even if you do disagree on things. That at the end of the day, they will do their job and follow your lead, simply recommending what they think is best, but letting you be the one to consent or decline those recommendations. And then choosing, having an open line of communication with your spouse, making sure you guys are talking through your own fears and insecurities, your hopes, doubts about how things may go, and then who else you might have at the birth, whether that be a family member or friend, perhaps a birth photographer as well. That's another option that people don't always consider. But whether you will have someone either in addition to a doula, if you choose to hire one, or someone who you would hope might serve similarly to a doula. And so it's not always easy to find someone who has that kind of passion for birth and that the knowledge behind how to support in that way. But sometimes we do have birth nerds in the family who, even though they never got the training, absolutely love supporting and can provide that kind of support in any kind of scenario, supporting your ideal birth plan, being completely on board with what you want, and helping you advocate for that when you're not able to advocate for yourself. So I hope this video was helpful to you. And if you are interested in learning more, I have my course, Confidently Prepared Birthing, that I am working on releasing at some point in the next year. And so I'll be sharing more details on that in the future. But for now, I'm just posting these videos here that I hope will be helpful to you in making these decisions. So thanks so much for watching. If you like this and found it beneficial, please leave a thumbs up and be sure to subscribe. Thanks.